Welcome to a conversation on international affairs. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our distinguished guest today is Sir Michael Howard, who is the Robert A. Lovett Professor of Military and Naval History at Yale University. Professor Howard is also the president of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He is the author of numerous books on European history, including War in European History. Professor Howard, welcome to Berkeley. 1989 was an extraordinary year. What was its historical significance in terms of the history of Europe?
I think one can say that it really was the end of a historical period which began in 1945. And my colleagues and historians who write textbooks will write textbooks about the history of Europe, 1945 to 1989, in exactly the same way as they wrote them 1871 to 1914 or 1914 to 1939. It was a moment when the whole structure of Europe fell apart. Usually that happens only at the end of a major war. But we are confronted at the end of 1989 with exactly the same situation as we were in 1945 or in 1918 or in 1814, when one of the major actors whose power and influence and ambitions had held the whole system together simply collapsed. And not as a result of military defeat, as had been the case in earlier ages, but as a result of a kind of internal implosion. And with that, all the previous structures and ideas had to be revised.
How important was Gorbachev in this process, or was it a matter of historical processes within the Soviet Union?
Well, great men can never be great unless an opportunity arises. Gorbachev was obviously of enormous importance because had it not been for him, events would not have occurred in the way that they did. But on the other hand, he was provided by a long-term historical process with the opportunity for taking certain kinds of actions. He did it with amazing boldness, rashness, courage, whatever you like to call it. But because he did so, and because he did it in the way that he did, events followed one another with catastrophic suddenness rather than with gentle evolution.
What would a sketch look like of the historical processes within the Soviet Union that you think he presented him with this opportunity?
The way I would put it is this, that the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917 as a result of defeat in war, and revolution was part of that. It took a long time for a new regime to establish itself. The Soviet economy was only just beginning to get itself on its feet when occurs World War II. World War II pushes the whole Soviet economy back to a 0 point. From 1945 onwards, it was very slowly building itself up again, and the regime under Stalin and his successors had such legitimacy as they did have because they were holding out to the Soviet people the prospect that although we start a long way back, we have got the right solution. Marxism-Leninism is the clue to historical development, and we will overtake the West, and we will, as Khrushchev said, bury the West. And the Soviet people probably believed this, tough as the going was. For about 20 years after 1945, they were building up. They had a standard of living constantly getting better, infinitely better than anything their parents had known. And then, during the 1970s or the 1980s, it becomes clear that they are not overtaking the West. It is clear that the system is not working. The appeal, the credibility of Marxist-Leninism as an ideology is gradually eroded. The flow of information into the Soviet Union and the growth of a global community makes it increasingly clear to not only the people as a whole, but the elites, that the system is not working, the system is failing them. And no doubt very large numbers of people were saying this to themselves at the end of the 70s and the beginning of 80s. But what happens is that somebody comes along and says the emperor has no clothes, and that person was Gorbachev.
How important do you think American policy was in giving that last push, that last shove to these historical forces at work in the Soviet Union?
I don't think it's the last shove. I think it is a sort of ongoing process, and if I may say so, not simply American policy, but Western policy as a whole. It is, in the first place, and I think most important of all, it is the image of the West as a successful society, providing all the promised results of Marx-Leninism, but under the capitalist system. Capitalism was seen to be working and known to be working as a whole. Secondly, I think that the continuing insistence on feeding in ideas from the West about the importance of political liberty and its association with economic success was also very important for the elites. The pressure of military competition, which is, of course, the most controversial question, whether that was really significant or not, I think it was significant. It did mean that the Soviet leaders felt it incumbent upon them to maintain a large military establishment in order to confront the West. And in order to do so, they had to bleed their economy white. We now know that they were spending 25% or upwards of their economy, of their GNP on defense. Now, right-wing thinkers say this only shows how strong and formidable the Soviet Union was. Others, like myself, says it only shows how weak they were. But certainly, the clear, I won't say inability of the Soviet Union to sustain that competition, but the realization on the part of their leaders that it was getting them nowhere was really significant, and made them look again at their relations with the West and think, is it really necessary to have this built-in hostility? What do we gain from it? And that, I think, was another of Gorbachev's great achievements. He turned to the Soviet Union and said, look, there is not a threat from the West. Why maintain all this hardware?
You mentioned in the beginning of our discussion that this was an era ending without war. How important to that reality was the existence of nuclear weapons, do you think? That a war did not occur in Europe in this period because both sides came to realize the implications of using of those weapons?
I wouldn't put a figure on how important. I would certainly say that it was clearly important. But I would not say that it was necessarily the definitive factor. The whole business of confrontation between the Soviet Union and the West, the fear of war between the Soviet Union and the West, even if there had not been nuclear weapons, would, I think, have imposed a considerable amount of discretion on both sides. The existence of nuclear weapons imposed a great deal more than discretion. But I'm not one of those who believe that if nuclear weapons had not been invented, we would have had a world war. I would say that the existence of nuclear weapons made it pretty certain that we would not have had one.
As we look back at this era that has ended and the whole question of its end, what year in history is 1989 most like?
Well, historians all, with one accord, focused upon 1848. Where there were many remarkable similarities. It occurred a generation after the end of the last great war, the Napoleonic Wars. It occurred because the system imposed at the Congress of Vienna, which was a very oppressive one for many peoples concerned, was no longer seen as having legitimacy. Nobody supported it very enthusiastically, and those who opposed it got increasingly emboldened. Further, it was precipitated by an economic crisis which caused real hardship to the working populations of Western Europe in very much the same way as the economic failure in the Soviet Union and the Soviet system did the same. And so there was a combination of intellectuals rising with a considerable degree of immediate working class support, and above all, a collapse of the will to govern among the actual incumbent regimes. Metternich, who was the architect of 1814, said throughout his life he was propping up a decaying edifice. Sooner or later it would collapse. And when the first riots occurred in the streets of Vienna, he shrugged his shoulders, ordered his carriage, went away. In exactly the same way as the leaders in Eastern Europe did. They must have been expecting this, the way in which they simply gave up. And finally, of course, the important thing in 1989 was that the great gendarme of the Soviet Union lost his nerve also, in the same way as the gendarme in 1848 was the Austrian Empire. When Metternich lost his nerve, everybody else did, and the whole thing collapsed.
Well, when we look back at this era that's ending, I would like to look at it in the context of a quotation from Deputy Secretary of State Eagleberger, who said the following really in mid-'89, before the drastic transformations in Eastern Europe. He said, "For all its risks and uncertainties, the Cold War was characterized by a remarkably stable and predictable set of relations among the great powers." Is that an adequate description, do you think?
I don't know whether it's adequate. Poor Eagleberger has taken an awful lot of stick because of that statement, but it was a fair statement of the situation. I don't think it was a value judgment, and I don't think that he conceived of it as a value judgment. The world between 1949, when the first clarification of the East-West confrontation, and 1989 was, in many respects, a fairly simple world. There was a single major threat, a single major adversary, and everything else could be and was related to that. I think in many respects very unwisely. I think the manner in which the United States related its whole policy towards the Third World, to its confrontation with the Soviet Union, was in many respects disastrous. Now that where simplistic pattern has gone, we are confronted with a world in all its complexity, which does demand very much more sophisticated solutions. And simplistic formulae are now no longer going to work. And I have a certain amount of sympathy with the officials who long for the good old days of simplistic formulae.
In a world like the one we're entering, an era has ended, institution building is required, leadership is required to sort of remake Europe. What does history tell us of the main strengths that we need to have? What kinds of particular talents? Where does the best hope lie for creating this new Europe?
Well, the first thing is that history never tells you anything. Historians tell you things, and historians are as fallacious and liable to error as anybody else. So please don't believe anybody who puts on a mask and says, "I am history, I am telling you what to do," and I'm not going to do that. I mean, this is simply me talking. What does me say? The first thing, this is history speaking, a knowledge of history is now really rather helpful. The Russian hegemony in Eastern Europe and the Marxist-Leninist freeze on political activity did halt almost in its paces a lot of developments which were going on. And now everything is unfreezing. And one has to go back and look at the way in which European history, especially in Eastern Europe, was developing in the 19th and early 20th century to understand a lot of the problems which are going to arise. The ongoing ethnic difficulties between Poles and Germans, between Germans and Czechs, Poles and Czechs, Slovaks and Hungarians, Hungarians and Romanians. All these complexities which indirectly or directly cause two world wars. And they are all out there in the open again. In order to be able to cope with them, we have got to have some understanding and some empathy with them. And that is why I think simple, overarching solutions, architectures devised, hammered out in Washington or in London, are not going to work. What is necessary, I think, is to see what are the forces which are making for stability on the ground in Eastern Europe, and come to that in the Soviet Union. What can we do to encourage them? And be modest about our capacity to influence these events. Now, if there is going to be one fairly simple formula, but remember how much I mistrust simple formula, one would say that it should be the encouragement of economic success in Eastern Europe, in the same way as the problems of Western Europe after 1945 were very largely solved by the degree to which Marshall Aid and the European Recovery Programme did put the Western European nations on their feet. And after that happened, it was then possible for us to deal with political rivalries and tensions which had previously bedeviled the whole scene. Now, if we can do that in Eastern Europe, splendid. But do not let us for a moment think that Eastern Europe presents the same kinds of problems as Western Europe. It doesn't. They're different. They're more difficult.
You recently wrote in the Times of London that this question of economic success was of equal importance to the old question of balance of power. Is that a fair restatement of what you were trying to say there?
Oh dear, I can't remember exactly what I said, but I think that, let me reformulate it. The previous peace settlements, and let's face it, we're now making a peace settlement like that of 1919 or that of 1814. The previous peace settlements were successful because, when they were successful, because they did create a viable balance of power in which all the major actors felt reasonably secure, reasonably satisfied. 1814 was successful because France, although defeated, was regarded as a partner who had to be consulted and whose interests had to be taken into account. 1919 was disastrous because we imposed on a Germany which was bound one day to become powerful again, a settlement which was unacceptable. And we have got to look back on those events to realize that the Soviet Union cannot be simply neglected now. She may be desperately weak and will be weak for many years, but she's still there. She'll come back. And one does not want her to be living under a settlement which she cannot do anything to prevent, but which she resents, detests, and is going to overthrow as soon as she has the capacity to do it. So to that extent, that old analogy of balance of power does apply. But we are living now in an era in which power is far more complex and diffuse than it was in the 19th and early 20th century. Power could then be reduced almost completely to military power. Now it cannot. Military power is significant, but it is not the most significant factor. And stability does depend increasingly on economic viability, economic stability. And the first essential, well, say, two equal essential points in this new settlement. One, it's got to be something which is acceptable to the Soviet Union, something it has got to be a foundation for economic viability and economic success in Eastern Europe as well as Western Europe and elsewhere, and ultimately even in the Soviet Union.
Gorbachev, several years back, talked about a European house. When one talks about the transformation of Europe, one has to ask the question, what is Europe?
Yes.
Who is in, who is out, and when will new members join it? What are your views on that very ticklish issue?
Well, European house as a concept is far too finite. It suggests a building which some people are in and some people are out. The analogy put forward, I think it was by Johan Holst, the Norwegian former Minister for Defense, was that we should think in terms of a European village, in which there was, as it were, or a European town, which is a downtown area, which is quite sort of definitely Europe and rather overcrowded and sort of rather honky-tonk, and a series of suburbs in which the dwellings get increasingly sparse. Well, in this you do have the downtown area of Europe, which is basically the European community, as at present constituted. But with that, there should be closely associated, as were the inner suburbs, which would be Central Europe, and then a little further out, Eastern European countries like Bulgaria and Romania, Yugoslavia. And then the far more complex issue of the Soviet Union, because European Russia is European, part of European culture. Cities like Leningrad, totally European in their appearance and everything to do with them, but partly entirely Asiatic. And we cannot get the whole of the Soviet Union into the European house, but one cannot exclude European Russia from it. So one has got to have a great degree of flexibility about it. And one cannot exclude the European derived societies on this side of the Atlantic from Europe. The United States and Canada have got such deep roots in Europe that they should be seen also as part of the community. So I would see Europe as a concentric area, and the settlement within Europe itself, within downtown Europe, should be such that we extend our prosperity and our culture certainly to the newly liberated countries of Central Europe. That is our first task. That's going to take us some time, and then see how far one does extend further than that to the east.
And there is a real threat that one might endanger the downtown area if one moves too quickly to incorporate the surrounding suburbs. Is that a fair...
Well, I think that it's not so much endangering the downtown area. It is that, well, let's abandon the analogy, which I think is probably exhausted its usefulness, so it isn't a bad one. That one thinks now of the European community as something very much more as a society, a club, if you will, which does postulate a certain degree of economic identity or economic comparability in all its members. And unfortunately at the moment there is not that economic comparability between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. I mean, we have hard enough problems absorbing the countries of Southern Europe like Portugal and Greece and Spain, and we're fully occupied with that. We really are not ready to extend ourselves very rapidly to the whole problem of the raising of the standard of living and the complex trade arrangements which are going to be necessary with countries like Poland. But the important thing is that the framework should be established. I think probably if one were to go back to the city analogy, that one is sort of staking out wider city boundaries to which eventually we are going to extend the facilities, the utilities, which at present simply cannot be absorbed.
What are Europe's primary security concerns as it reshapes its future?
Residually, we can never forget about the problem of a Soviet Union which, whatever its political and social structure, is going to be far more militarily powerful than all the rest of us put together. And as its economy does recover, so its military potential will recover. Our hope, and I think it's a reasonable one, is as its economy recovers, it will become much more of a society akin to our own, and no longer one which we see as any kind of a threat, no kind of alien. But nonetheless it is there. It has a formidable arsenal of nuclear weapons. It has a great conventional military capability. And if there were to be a confrontation, we're going to need all the help we can get from the United States. Now, that is going to underlie our security considerations for quite a time yet. But otherwise, they're far more complex. And they're as much internal as external. The problem of preserving the cohesion of our own societies, which is becoming very great. And that is tied up with the problem of multi-ethnicity. As our societies absorb more and more peoples from the third world, who bring with them ways of life and systems of belief, which is very difficult to integrate into old sort of European cultures, and which in many cases are in a state of confrontation, if not hostility, with Western liberalism. And that links up, of course, with the instability of the Mediterranean and Middle East countries, and the existence of Muslim fundamentalist societies, and societies which, even if they don't go the whole way to Muslim fundamentalism, are temperamentally anti-Western, resent and dislike what they see as a sort of Western economic and cultural hegemony, and are not unwilling to do us harm. Now, that is a far more complex and I think a far more immediate and ongoing problem. But it's one to which military power only provides a very, very small tithe of the solution.
What about the issue of boundary disputes, the ethnic and national tensions that you had spoken of early, which are in Europe's history? Do you see that as leading to kinds of confrontation within Europe between parts of Europe that will require a new way of thinking about security?
I think that these can be exaggerated. The problems are there, and they won't go away. We have problems in Western Europe of a comparable kind. I need only mention Northern Ireland to show what I mean. And this is a problem which we have not solved. It's one which we can live with. It's disagreeable, but it is not, as it were, destabilizing. The French and the Spaniards have the problems with the Basques. Now, there are going to be a lot of problems in Eastern Europe. The major one, of course, is that between the Hungarians and the Romanians. And this will require a great deal of skillful crisis management to defuse. There aren't very many other really major ones. There are problems, minor problems between Czechs and Poles. There are problems about the boundaries of Ukraine and Poland and the Soviet Union. There are problems between the Poles and the Lithuanians, and to say nothing about the whole problem of the independence of the Baltic states. But they are not beyond the wit of man to resolve by normal techniques of crisis management. And it is foreseen, I think, with a certain amount of realism, that the structure of the CSCE, the Helsinki group of, what is it, 35 nations or so, could provide a very useful mini-UN to provide the kind of good offices in resolving that kind of problem, and many others to do with the European village.
You're speaking of the Conference on Cooperation and Security in Europe, which was is an ongoing dialogue, I guess one would say, started as an ongoing dialogue between East and West that involved really all of the European states.
That is right. Yeah. It was started really as an offshoot of West Germany's Ostpolitik to create a framework within which we could discuss not simply the settlement of European frontiers, but also questions of economic cooperation and, above all, issues of human rights. And that has been set up and has worked not at all badly as a forum in which these matters are discussed. And that is now seen by rather, I think, optimistic people in Europe as being the way in which Europe's all Europe's security problems can in future be resolved. I think that that is jumping the gun a bit. But nonetheless, it does have, I think, a major role to play, especially in crisis management questions of the kind which you referred to.
What about nuclear weapons? They have been so important in our security concerns in this era that's ending. What about the future? What role do they have in ensuring Europe's mutual security?
It's remarkable, isn't it, how little people have been talking or worrying about nuclear weapons over the last year or so. But they are still there. And a large number of them are in the Soviet Union. And in the event of there being a serious political and social disintegration of the Soviet Union, then I think there's real cause for worry what is going to happen to these. If there were to be a civil war of some kind in the Soviet Union, if there were to be a sort of major confrontation between a military backed group and other backed groups, we, I think, would be very worried indeed about the stability of the situation there. But that's a little way along the line. So long as the Soviet Union does have nuclear weapons, there is, I'm afraid, structured into the situation a certain requirement that formal deterrence should remain. And most of us in Western Europe wish to see the linkage with the United States deterrent capability preserved by one way or another. And we may or may not go on to discuss that. But it should be possible now, presented with a friendly Soviet Union, genuinely, so far as one can see, anxious to run down its military expenditure, for arms control discussions and reduction of strategic arms to take place with a far better prospect of success than in the past. One then goes on to questions of the need for nuclear weapons in the strategy of West European defense, and they are being eliminated fairly rapidly, so far as one can see. Can't be too rapidly for me, and always detested the things. But I think what is coming up over the horizon, the next problem, is going to be proliferation of nuclear weapons. And not simply of nuclear weapons, but of conventional weapons. I don't want to get off nuclear weapons at the moment, but if I could just make this point.
Yes.
With the rundown of military establishments and hardware and on both sides at a fairly rapid rate, there's going to be an enormous amount of weaponry available. And it's not only going to be a temptation, it's going to be almost a necessity to sell this to the highest bidder. And so third world countries are going to be picking up a lot of very, very effective weaponry, very cheap indeed. And this is not going to be exactly stabilizing in those areas. And I'm a little worried about that as a spin-off of the settlement in Europe.
It's interesting, all the discussions about Europe's mutual security really focus on security within Europe and between the new parts of Europe, but you're really raising the whole question of security concerns that deal with areas outside of Europe.
Global
yeah,
security.
global, yeah.
Yes.
But I hear you saying that really, as part of this transformation of Europe, its definition of its future, security means something entirely different now. I mean, there's still things that we have to worry about that relate back to the concerns of the old era, but we're really looking at a new definition that involves economic well-being, social well-being, and so on.
Exactly. One point which is not often discussed, well, no, let me put it this way. Everything that I have said and everything that most people are saying postulates the continuing stability and economic success of the West. What if we're wrong about that? What if there were to be a major recession in the West? What is the effect of that going to be on our capacity not simply to help East Europe and the Soviet Union, but to preserve stability within our own societies? If we're no longer going to be able to meet what is no longer a revolution of rising expectations but a plateau of high expectancy of standard of living within our own countries and elsewhere. One is then going, I think, to have a very unstable internal and external situation. So, far more important than military balances or balance of power of any kind is our capacity to make the global economy work. And if we can't do that, then I think we're going to go back to an age of tensions, of ethnic violence, in which once again, alas, military power may be significant.
A word that has not come up yet, but which one has to bring up when you have a distinguished historian such as yourself here, is the issue of sovereignty. This is obviously going to be key to designing Europe's future.
Yes.
The extent to which states are willing, both in the economic and possibly in the security area, to give up some of that sovereignty and give it to some higher supranational authority. What is the prognosis there? What are going to be the difficulties on the road to accomplishing that end?
Well, any student of international relations, such as yourself, knows that we have got long past the point when the concept of sovereign nations is any longer valid. Mm-hmm. It is still may just apply in a major power like the United States, though the extent to which your economy is dependent upon the fluctuations in a global market does erode your sovereignty. Mm-hmm. In smaller countries, such as my own, we are no longer, our issues major issues can no longer really be resolved within our own countries by our own parliaments. We have, without particularly willing it, become so dependent upon what is going on in our immediate neighbors, to say nothing of our dependence upon the United States mm-hmm. for our military security, that sovereignty is now a concept of diminishing value, I think, in discussing the realities of the world situation. I think that one has got to analyze fairly carefully what are the issues which can still be resolved within the old framework of sovereign nations, and which should be, and which can be. Clearly, the whole sort of democratic process does demand that, so far as possible, all these issues should be decentralized, and we all determine our own destinies as much as possible. But the increasing complexity of the world, the increasing integration of the global community does mean that the level at which this can really be done is getting pushed higher and higher. And the problem of the European community is to create a political structure which is going to be answerable to the grassroots people of Europe itself. I don't know whether you would like me to go on about this, but I will just in one respect. What worries a lot of people, not only Mrs. Thatcher, but a lot of people in Britain and indeed on continental Europe, about the structure of the European community, is that decisions are taken by a European Commission which is basically not responsible to anybody very much. Mm-hmm. And the more decisions which get devolved upwards onto this body means more and more decisions are taken by a bureaucracy which is very able and very well informed, but really has no basic responsibility to the likes of you and me. And there is no way in which the European community will become a serious political entity until we do solve that constitutional problem.
In these questions, and related to this answer, is this question of what institutions will take the lead in this future, whether in the economic realm or in the security realm. What about this problem of we've had no war. Institutions really haven't been destroyed, but clearly they have to be transformed. In the security area, the question is, well, how important will NATO be in the future? Or will we turn to the Conference on Security and Cooperation? So again and again, this question is going to come up. What does this historian think about this set of issues? Will the key be flexibility in our willingness to transform institutions, or will it be a willingness to just leave institutions and found new ones?
Well, what this historian thinks about institutions is that all attempts to solve the problems of the world by creating brand new institutions like the League of Nations or the United Nations have failed. The world is too slippery, too complex, too dynamic a place to be fitted within nice sort of institutions which can cope with smaller problems within single cultures. Even then they have to be pretty flexible. And that you use the word flexibility, and I'm sure that that is right. We at the moment do have a whole multiplicity of institutions, and I think that that is a good thing. In the past, the most effective institution for dealing with European problems was not an institution at all. It was a system which was called the Concert of Europe, which simply consisted of the sort of major statesmen of Europe realizing they had got to get together at regular intervals and sort out problems which were of common interest to them. They didn't even establish a secretariat. It was a habit of mind which kept the peace in Europe for 40 years, effectively almost for 100 years. Well, now, alas, the situation is too complex to be soluble by habits of mind. But the complexity does, I think, demand overlapping institutions, each of them with a separate focus and center of gravity. NATO, still the major institution in which, for the time being at least, Western Europe will look for its continuing security, because it does link us with the United States, and it also does provide a valid container for the increased power of Germany. The European Community, as an area for providing the essential economic stability, not only for ourselves, but increasingly for the rest of Europe as traditionally understood. The CSCE as providing a very flexible framework which will bring in the Soviet Union into our discussions, together with many other people, and will provide a general framework for overall stability. All these, I think, are going to be of continuing value. We may see some become strengthened at the expense of others. We may ultimately see NATO no longer required by anybody and gently fading away. But I don't see that happening for some time yet.
We talked earlier about the problem of dealing with a power in decline like the Soviet Union as we think about Europe transforming itself. The other major problem here, of course, is the problem of what I guess we should call an ascendant power, that is Germany. Is Germany a problem in this equation as we think about the future of Europe, or is it not a problem?
Well, it's a problem, but it is also an opportunity. I would like to see it as an opportunity, but one has to accept that it's a problem. And it's a problem because people think it's a problem. And as all psychologists know, if you think you've got a problem, you've got a problem. I mean, America thinks they've got a problem about decline, and therefore you have got a problem. It's a non-problem, but still. Now, and I think that in many ways German unity is the same kind of problematic non-problem. Everybody is desperately worried that reunited Germany is going to start becoming once again have kind of Wilhelmine ambitions or Nazi hysteria. In fact, we all know that German society has changed so totally that there's no question of reverting to historical eras which are ganz vorbei, are no longer there. But it will be a very strong economic power. It will be geopolitically a very important power, no longer on the fringes of, but at the center of Europe. It is going to be the heart of Europe. and it is going to be the heart of the community. I am not over-worried about this. I have great respect for the Germans and no doubt whatever about their capacity to exercise the power and influence which they will have with moderation and discretion and common sense. But one has got to accept and get used to the idea that Germany is now going to be the major dynamic power in Europe and is going, so far as the United States is concerned, a competitor comparable to Japan.
So is the key here making Germany continually a part of European processes? Is that the key to constraining whatever possibility exists for Germany going on its own and causing problems comparable to those that history have indicated?
Yes. Shall we say, unwelcome scenario, but an unlikely one, is that of a Germany which cuts its links with the West, which establishes a position of neutrality, non-alignment, independence, whatever you like to say, starts throwing its weight about unilaterally in Eastern Europe, scares the Soviet Union stiff, and is, as everybody says, a loose cannon on the deck. That is, knowing the Germans, or the West Germans as one does, such a remote possibility that it doesn't worry me too much. But West Germany is already deeply integrated into Western Europe and deeply integrated into NATO. And that's the way in which one would wish to see it continued, and the way in which almost all West Germans wish it to go. And East Germans seem to be prepared to accept. So it is not, I think, a matter of creating a new structure in order to deal with a new problem. It's a matter of continuing to do the kind of things which have been done very successfully over the past few decades.
And I take it that you feel U.S. participation in this process is very important. Why?
Well, participation, yes. Leadership, no. I get rather worried when people start talking about the need for United States leadership in Europe. There was a great need for United States leadership in Europe in 1950. It provided for us not simply money and not simply troops, but an overwhelming sense of security, that the Americans are there, they're behind us, they're looking after us. And as a result, we were able to get on our feet again to the extent we have. Now, there is no longer a need for that. It isn't a matter of America being in decline or any of that nonsense. It is a matter of the Europeans being now sufficiently mature, sufficiently politically stable, and above all, sufficiently economically wealthy to be able to handle most of our problems ourselves. The major military problem we cannot yet handle. But what we do need, I think, is the continuing reassurance of American help and American goodwill. If only because a Europe which is entirely cut off from the United States will not in itself be necessarily a very stable community. On the one hand, people will be looking over their shoulders at the Soviet Union and think, are they starting to come back? Are there going to be problems with them? And others, Poles, French, even Brits, will be looking over their shoulder at the Germans. Are they going to continue to be as good as they are now? So the continuation of an environment in which the United States is seen as deeply interested in and committed to the security of the European system is, I think, very desirable.
We've talked a lot about the events of '89 and use that as a platform to talk about the shaping of Europe's future. In these dialogues, what contribution do you think the historical sensibility has to offer as we look at these two sets of problems?
Well, I think there's one thing which historians can do, and there's one thing which they cannot do. They can tell you how we have got to where we are. They cannot tell you where we're going from here. And any prognostications I make about the future, as I said earlier, are of no particular, have no advantage over those which anybody else makes. And historians have always got to say that events are dependent, developments are dependent on unforeseen contingencies. Nobody, no historian, no political scientist, nobody else foresaw what was going to happen in 1989. They didn't foresee it was going to happen in 1989. They didn't foresee it was going to happen at all. And quite rightly so. So what the historian can do is say these are the problems which you're presented with. We're presented with them because of these historical processes. This is the data which you will have to work on in order to settle these problems. And in the past, certain kinds of solutions have worked and certain others have not. Which are the stable elements and which are the variables? Very difficult to say. A system which appears to enjoy good historical precedents, and therefore we ought to do it again, may be completely wrong, because there are variables in the situation which nobody has actually discerned. But you cannot approach any question of European settlement or any other settlement without a thorough understanding of the historical background which has created the situation.
So that history really, in some way, should be an important element in the process by which we train the people who will make our policy.
As a historian, you would not expect me to betray my profession by saying anything else.
Professor Howard, thank you very much for being with us today for this very useful discussion about the era that has just ended and your reflections, although it's not the task of the historian, I understand, to project the future, but these were very insightful views, and we thank you very much for being here today.
My pleasure.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation on international affairs.
For information on this series, contact the Institute of International Studies, 215 Moses Hall, UC Berkeley, Berkeley, California 94720, or call area code 415-642-2474.